The shelter's fluorescent lights hummed with a dull, relentless buzz that never quite let anyone forget where they were. Row after row of thin mattresses stretched across the concrete floor, separated only by the invisible boundaries of desperation that kept strangers from meeting each other's eyes. The air was thick with the smell of industrial disinfectant, trying to mask the scent of too many bodies pressed into too small a space, of lives that had slipped through society's cracks and landed here, in this warehouse of broken dreams. Sarah Mitchell sat on the edge of her cot, her back curved with exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. At 34, she looked older, lines etched around her eyes from nights of worry, her hands roughened from whatever work she could find, her shoulders carrying a weight that never lifted. So beside her, propped against a thin pillow, lay the reason she kept breathing, kept fighting, kept waking up every morning when every part of her wanted to surrender. Her son, Daniel, was 7 years old, but cerebral palsy had stolen so much of what other children his age took for granted. His legs, thin and twisted, could not support his weight. His hands curled inward, the fingers bent at angles that made grasping things nearly impossible. Yet his eyes, those bright hazel eyes that reminded Sarah of her own mother, sparkled with intelligence and love that broke through every limitation his body imposed. He could not run, could not play, could barely speak in words others could understand. But when he looked at his mother, when his crooked smile spread across his face, she saw more courage than she had found in anyone else in her entire life. She smoothed his hair back from his forehead, feeling the warmth of his skin, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing. He had fallen asleep hours ago, exhausted from another day spent in the cramped shelter where there was nothing for a child to do, nowhere to go, no space to simply be a child. Sarah swallowed hard against the lump rising in her throat. This was no place for him. This was no place for any child. But it was all they had. The journey to this shelter had been long and brutal, a slow descent that had begun 2 years earlier, when her husband, Daniel's father, had walked out of their apartment and never returned. No note, no explanation, just empty drawers and a silence that screamed louder than any argument ever had. She had tried to hold things together alone, juggling 2 jobs while managing Daniel's therapy appointments, his medical needs, the constant attention he required. But the bills had multiplied faster than her paychecks could cover them. Medical debt swallowed her savings. The landlord's patience ran out. And one cold November morning, she found an eviction notice taped to their door. Her family had not been there to catch them. Her father, bitter and judgmental, had told her years ago that marrying a man with no prospects would lead to ruin. When she called him, desperate, asking for help, he had said the words that still echoed in her nightmares. "You made your choices, Sarah. Now live with them." Her sister, comfortable in her suburban life, had offered thoughts and prayers, but no room in her guest bedroom. "We just don't have the space," she had said, though Sarah knew the real reason. Daniel made people uncomfortable. His twisted limbs, his garbled speech, his need for constant care, it was easier for them to look away than to help. So Sarah had done what she had to. She sold what little they owned. She found a shelter that would take them both. And she had begun the exhausting routine of searching for work during the day, while caring for Daniel every spare moment, all while pretending to him that this was temporary, that soon they would have a home again, that everything would be okay. She had become an expert at lying to the person she loved most. The caseworker assigned to them, a tired woman named Linda, who had seen too many stories like theirs, tried to be encouraging. But even Linda's optimism had limits. "The waiting list for housing assistance is 3 years long," she had explained gently. "With Daniel's medical needs, we're trying to expedite things, but..." The sentence had trailed off into the same void where all their hopes seemed to disappear. Sarah worked when she could find shifts, cleaning office buildings at night, stocking shelves at a 24-hour grocery store, anything that paid cash and didn't ask too many questions. She brought Daniel with her sometimes, settling him in a corner with a blanket and the few worn toys they still had, whispering to him to be quiet, to be good, to be invisible. Other times, she left him with a shelter volunteer, her heart tearing itself apart with every step she took away from him, terrified something would happen while she was gone. The other residents at the shelter fell into 3 categories: those who pretended Sarah and Daniel didn't exist, those who offered brief kindness before retreating into their own struggles, and those who looked at her with pity that felt like acid on her skin. She hated the pity most of all. It made her feel like a victim, like someone whose story was already written, whose ending was already determined. But late at night, when Daniel's breathing was the only sound she allowed herself to focus on, she wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe this was all there would ever be. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, handed to her by the shelter's front desk clerk with a puzzled expression. "This came for you," the woman said, as if she couldn't quite believe anyone would send mail to a homeless shelter. The envelope was official-looking, thick, cream-colored paper with a law firm's name embossed in the corner. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened it, Daniel watching her with curious eyes from his wheelchair, the donated chair that was too small for him now, but which they couldn't afford to replace. The words swam before her eyes at first, legal language dense and confusing. But as she read more slowly, certain phrases began to emerge, like lights breaking through fog. Estate of Colonel Marcus Webb, distant relative, military installation, transfer of property ownership, nominal fee of $1. Her breath caught in her throat. Colonel Marcus Webb had been her mother's uncle, a man Sarah had met only once as a child, stern and imposing in his uniform, and someone who existed more as a photograph on her grandmother's mantel than as a real person in her life. She had heard he died a few months ago, but she hadn't expected anything to come from it. They had never been close. She couldn't imagine why he would leave her anything. But according to the letter from the law firm handling his estate, he had. The property in question was described as a decommissioned radar installation located in a remote area 2 hours outside the city. The letter explained that Colonel Webb had purchased it years ago for next to nothing after the military abandoned it. He had apparently intended to restore it, but never did. Now, as part of settling his estate and lacking any closer heirs who wanted the burden of the property, his executors were offering it to Sarah for $1, on the legal minimum for a property transfer. The letter was clear about the condition. The installation was in significant disrepair, had no utilities connected, and came with no guarantees of habitability. It was, the lawyer noted in carefully neutral language, essentially a liability. Most people would consider it worthless. If she didn't want it, they would simply demolish it and sell the land to cover the estate's debts. Sarah read the letter 3 times, her mind racing. A building, even a ruined building, was more than she had now. It was land, space, 4 walls, and a roof, however damaged. It was possibility. She called the number on the letterhead, her voice shaking as she explained who she was. The lawyer who answered sounded surprised. She had even bothered to call back. "Mrs. Mitchell, I should be very clear with you," he said, his tone carrying the careful patience of someone used to managing expectations. "The installation is not in livable condition. It would require extensive work just to make it safe, let alone comfortable. The costs would far exceed any value the property currently has. Frankly, we included you in the notification as a formality. We expected to simply proceed with demolition." "But it's mine if I want it," Sarah pressed, ignoring the warning in his voice. "For $1? A pause. "Yes, legally. If you pay the $1 and sign the transfer documents, ownership would pass to you. "But Mrs. Mitchell, I strongly advise—" "I want it," she interrupted, her voice firmer than it had been in months. "I'll take it." Another pause, longer this time. She could almost hear the lawyer's frown through the phone. "Very well. I'll have the paperwork prepared. You'll need to come to the office to sign and provide the payment. After that, the property is yours, along with all responsibilities and liabilities associated with it." When Sarah hung up, her hands were still trembling, but now it was from something other than fear. It was the faint, dangerous stirring of hope. That evening, she told Linda, the caseworker, about the property. Linda's reaction was immediate and concerned. "Sarah, honey, you can't be serious. A decommissioned radar bunker in the middle of nowhere? How would you even get there? How would you manage Daniel's medical needs without access to his doctors, his therapists? You don't have a car. You don't have money for repairs or utilities. This sounds like a disaster waiting to happen." "It's a roof over our heads," Sarah countered, on her jaw set. "It's ours. No more shelter rotations. No more being moved from place to place. No more depending on charity that could disappear any day." "It's also potentially dangerous," Linda said gently. "If the building is unstable, if there's no heat or water, if you're that isolated—" "Sarah, I'm worried you're so desperate for a solution that you're not thinking this through." "I've thought about nothing else since I got the letter," Sarah replied, and it was true. In the hours since reading those words, her mind had spun through every possibility, every risk, every potential outcome. "Linda, we're already living in the worst-case scenario. Homeless, no prospects, watching my son grow up on a shelter floor. How much worse can it get?" Linda opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. They both knew Sarah was right. No, when you had nothing, even a dangerous something looked like wealth. The news spread quickly through the shelter and beyond. Sarah's sister called, her voice dripping with condescension. "A radar bunker, Sarah? Really? This is insane, even for you. You're dragging Daniel into some fantasy because you refuse to face reality. Give him up to foster care where he can get proper care. Get yourself sorted out. And stop this nonsense." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. "He's my son," she said, her voice cold. "I will never give him up." "Then you're condemning him to suffer with you," her sister shot back. "That's not love, Sarah. That's selfishness." The call ended with Sarah's hand shaking so badly she could barely press the button to disconnect. Daniel, in his chair beside her, reached out with his bent fingers and touched her arm. His eyes, so full of trust, looked up at her. She knelt beside him, pressing her forehead to his, fighting back tears. "We're going to be okay," she whispered to him. "I promise. We're going to have a home." Former friends from her old life before the eviction, before the homelessness, before everything fell apart, sent messages on social media when they heard. Most were variations of the same theme. "Are you sure this is a good idea? Maybe you should reconsider. I'm worried about you." None of them offered actual help. None of them offered to visit the property with her, to assess it, to support her decision. They offered only doubt dressed up as concern. The shelter residents were divided. Some thought she was brave. Others thought she was crazy. One older woman, herself living between shelters for the past 5 years, pulled Sarah aside one evening. "Honey, I hope you know what you're doing," she said, not unkindly. "The system is hard, but at least here, you've got a bed, meals, a roof. Out there, if something goes wrong, you're on your own." "I'm already on my own," Sarah replied quietly. "At least this way, I'm on my own in a place that's mine." The day came to sign the papers. Sarah dressed in the cleanest clothes she had, carried Daniel in her arms because navigating the lawyer's building with his wheelchair proved too difficult, and sat across from a mahogany desk that probably cost more than she had earned in the past year. The lawyer slid documents across the polished surface, pointing to signature lines, explaining clauses and conditions in rapid legal speak that washed over her like rain. She signed. She handed over a single crumpled dollar bill from her pocket. And just like that, she owned property. The lawyer gave her a key, thick and old-fashioned, attached to a keyring with a faded tag that read, Installation 7. He also handed her a folder containing what records existed about the property, old blueprints, maintenance logs from decades ago, photographs from when the military still operated the site. "Good luck, Mrs. Mitchell," he said, and there was something in his expression that looked like pity mixed with disbelief, as if he were watching someone walk voluntarily into disaster. Sarah took the key and the folder, thanked him with a dignity she didn't feel, and left. Outside in the parking lot, she sat in the passenger seat of Linda's car, from the caseworker having offered to drive them to see the property before Sarah committed to moving there. Daniel was buckled into the back seat, his eyes wide as he watched the city slide past the windows. The drive took them away from familiar streets, past suburbs that thinned into farmland, then into stretches of empty highway where trees crowded close and gas stations grew sparse. Linda drove in silence, her disapproval radiating like heat, but to her credit, she didn't try to change Sarah's mind again. They both knew it was too late for that. Finally, after nearly 2 hours, Linda turned onto a narrow access road marked only by a faded sign that read, Private property. No trespassing. The road was cracked and overgrown, weeds pushing through the asphalt, branches scraping the sides of the car. Then they drove for another 10 minutes along this forgotten path until the trees opened up, and there it was. The radar installation rose from the earth like a concrete tomb, a sprawling brutalist structure of thick walls and narrow windows, now mostly broken. The central building was low and wide, built to withstand attacks that never came, designed for a war that had ended decades ago. Behind it, Sarah could see what must have been the radar tower itself, a skeletal frame of metal pointing uselessly at the sky, half of it collapsed into twisted wreckage. Graffiti scarred some of the outer walls, rust streaked down from broken gutters. The grounds around it were a wilderness of tall grass, scattered debris, and the hulking shapes of abandoned equipment slowly being consumed by nature. Linda let out a slow breath. Sarah. It's not as bad as I thought, Sarah lied, her voice barely above a whisper. Because the truth was, it was exactly as bad as she had feared, and worse. This wasn't a fixer-upper. This was a ruin. This was a monument to abandonment. But it was hers. She unbuckled Daniel from his car seat and carried him toward the main entrance, Linda following reluctantly behind. The front door, a massive steel slab, stood slightly ajar, forced open at some point by vandals or scavengers. Sarah pushed it wider, the hinges shrieking in protest, and stepped inside. The smell hit her first, damp concrete, mildew, and the musty scent of decay. The entry corridor was dark, only thin streams of light penetrating through cracks in the walls. She fumbled for her phone, turning on its flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom to reveal a space that seemed to stretch on forever. Hallways branched off in multiple directions. Signs on the walls, faded and peeling, pointed toward control room, communications, personnel quarters. Their footsteps echoed as they moved deeper inside, Sarah's grip on Daniel tightening unconsciously. The walls were thick, oppressive, designed to protect against bombs and radiation, but now they just felt suffocating. Some rooms they passed were completely empty, bare concrete boxes. Others contained remnants of their former purpose, rusted metal desks, overturned filing cabinets, tangles of old wiring hanging from the ceiling like dead vines. Linda's voice broke the silence. Sarah, there's no power, no water, no heat. The place is falling apart. How are you planning to live here? We'll figure it out, Sarah said, though she had no idea how. People have lived with less. Not people with a disabled child who needs medical care, Linda pressed. Not people without resources or backup plans. Sarah stopped walking and turned to face the caseworker, her expression fierce. Linda, I appreciate everything you've done for us. I really do. But this is my decision. This is my son. And this, she gestured at the darkness surrounding them, is my chance. Maybe my only chance. I'm not asking you to understand it. I'm just asking you to accept it. Linda looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay, she said softly. Okay, Sarah. But promise me you'll call if things get dangerous. Promise me you won't sacrifice your safety or Daniel's because of pride. I promise, Sarah agreed, though both of them knew it was an empty promise. Pride was all she had left. They explored more of the installation, moving carefully through darkened rooms and unstable corridors. Sarah's flashlight revealed spaces both vast and claustrophobic, areas where the concrete was cracked and water had seeped in, creating pools on the floor, and other areas that seemed almost intact, protected by the building's fortress-like construction. In what had once been the personnel quarters, they found a series of small rooms with metal bed frames bolted to the walls, the mattresses long since removed or rotted away. These rooms were dry, at least, with doors that still closed. We could stay here, Sarah said, gesturing to one of the rooms. Just temporarily, until I can figure out how to get power and water running. With what money? Linda asked, not cruelly, just factually. Sarah, you have maybe $300 to your name. That won't even cover hiring someone to assess the electrical system, let alone repair it. Then I'll learn to do it myself, Sarah replied, her voice hardening. I'll find books, videos, whatever I need. I'll figure it out. Daniel, still in her arms, made a soft sound. Sarah looked down at him, seeing his eyes darting around the dark room with a mixture of fear and curiosity. She kissed his forehead. It's going to be okay, baby, she whispered. This is going to be our home. I'm going to make it work. They spent another hour exploring, Sarah mentally cataloging what needed to be done. Clear out debris, seal broken windows, find some way to generate power, locate a water source, make the space livable. The list felt overwhelming, impossible. But she had already made her choice. There was no going back to the shelter now. Even if she wanted to, she had surrendered her spot by accepting the property. This was their future now, for better or worse. As they prepared to leave, Linda having agreed to help Sarah move the few possessions they had stored at the shelter, Sarah paused in the entrance corridor. Something on the wall caught her eye, a faded directory listing all the sections of the installation. Most of the names meant nothing to her. Communications hub, power distribution, administrative offices. But one listing at the bottom made her pause. Storage level, restricted access. What's a storage level? She asked aloud. Linda shrugged. Be probably where they kept supplies, equipment, maybe archived documents. Why? Just curious, Sarah said, filing the information away. If there was a storage level, it might contain things they could use, tools, materials, anything that could help them survive here. The drive back to the city was quiet. Daniel fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted by the day. Sarah stared out the window, watching the wilderness give way to civilization again, and felt the weight of her decision settling into her bones. She had just committed herself and her son to living in a cold war relic with no resources, no support, and no backup plan. Everyone thought she was crazy. Maybe they were right. But as she glanced back at Daniel, sleeping peacefully despite everything, when she felt the conviction that had driven her this far harden into something unbreakable. She would make this work. She had to. Because the alternative, surrendering to a system that had already failed them, giving up the one chance she had to provide her son with a home, that was not an option she could accept. The radar installation waited in the darkness and distance, silent and imposing. In 3 days, she would return with everything they owned, stuffed into a few garbage bags and boxes. In 3 days, she would walk through that steel door, with Daniel in her arms, and close it behind them. In 3 days, their new life would begin. And Sarah Mitchell, homeless mother with a disabled son, owner of a worthless military installation purchased for $1, would either prove everyone wrong or confirm every doubt they had ever whispered about her. The weight of that reality pressed down on her shoulders as Linda's car carried them back toward the shelter for one of their last nights there. But beneath the fear, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the overwhelming sense of impossibility, a small flame burned in Sarah's chest. It was hope, fragile and desperate, but undeniably alive. And sometimes, hope was all you needed to take the first step into the dark. The 3 days before the move passed in a blur of frantic preparation and mounting dread. Sarah packed their meager belongings, a few changes of clothes, Daniel's medications carefully organized in a zippered pouch, blankets, a camping stove someone had donated months ago, bottles of water, non-perishable food, flashlights and batteries, and the worn, stuffed rabbit Daniel had clung to since he was a baby. Everything they owned fit into 4 large trash bags and 2 cardboard boxes. Looking at the pile, Sarah felt the absurdity of her situation hit her again. This was it. This was all they had, to start a new life in an abandoned military installation. Linda had gone silent after their visit to the bunker, but true to her word, she hadn't tried to stop Sarah. Instead, she helped in quiet ways, bringing extra supplies, connecting Sarah with a volunteer who had an old generator he was willing to donate, and providing information about rural aid programs that might help once they were settled. The caseworker's face remained troubled, but she kept her doubts to herself now, recognizing that Sarah's mind was made up. The other shelter residents reacted with a mixture of emotions. Some offered small gifts, canned food, old jackets, a Bible with verses highlighted about endurance and faith. Others avoided her entirely, as if her decision was contagious, as if acknowledging it might force them to confront their own trapped circumstances. One woman, younger than Sarah, with 2 small children of her own, grabbed her arm in the hallway. "You're brave," she whispered. "I wish I had somewhere to go, anywhere." "Good luck." Sarah's family made their final pleas. Her father called, his voice gruff with the particular anger of someone who hated being proven right. "This is it, Sarah," he said. "You go through with this insanity, and don't come crawling back when it all falls apart. I'm done enabling your poor choices." "I never asked you to enable anything," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the pain. "I asked you to help your daughter and grandson. You refused. So yes, this is it. Goodbye, Dad." She hung up before he could respond, her hands shaking. Daniel watched her from his wheelchair, his eyes full of questions he couldn't articulate. She knelt beside him, taking his twisted fingers in hers. "It's just us now, baby," she said softly. "Just us against the world. But we're going to be okay. I promise." Her sister sent a final text message. "When this disaster happens, and they take Daniel away, because you can't care for him properly in that bunker, don't say I didn't warn you. You're being selfish and delusional. Get help." Sarah blocked the number, and she couldn't afford to carry anyone else's doubt alongside her own. On the morning of the move, Linda arrived with the donated generator strapped in her trunk and a man named Joe, a retired veteran who had heard about Sarah's situation through the shelter network. Joe was in his 60s, weathered and quiet, but his eyes held a kindness that Sarah desperately needed. "I served at installations like the one you're heading to," he said, as he helped load their belongings. "Different time, different war, but same bones. I'll come out with you, help you get set up, show you what I can about the basics. No promises, but at least you'll know which wires not to touch." Sarah wanted to hug him, but settled for a trembling "thank you" that carried the weight of her gratitude. The drive out was longer this time, weighed down by the finality of it. This wasn't a visit anymore. This was moving day. Daniel sat in his car seat, watching the world slide past, and Sarah wondered what was going through his mind. Did he understand they were leaving the city behind? Did he sense his mother's fear beneath her forced optimism? When the installation came into view again, appearing through the trees like a concrete giant, Sarah felt her stomach drop. In the gray light of an overcast morning, it looked even more forbidding than she remembered. Joe, however, seemed unfazed. "Solid construction," he commented, surveying the building with a professional eye. "They built these things to last. Main structure looks intact, which is more than I expected. You've got something to work with here." His calm assessment helped Sarah steady her nerves. They unloaded everything, carrying bags and boxes through the shrieking steel door into the dark corridor beyond. Linda had brought battery-powered lanterns, and their glow pushed back some of the oppression as they set up a temporary living space in one of the personnel quarter rooms Sarah had identified on their first visit. Joe examined the generator, a battered old machine that looked like it had seen better decades, and declared it functional. "This'll give you a few hours of power if you're careful," he said. "Enough to run a space heater, charge your phone, power some lights. But you'll need fuel, and you'll need to ration it. This isn't a long-term solution." "Nothing about this is long-term," Linda muttered, but she helped arrange blankets on the metal bed frame, creating a nest for Daniel. Joe spent the afternoon showing Sarah the basics of the installation's layout, pointing out which areas seemed structurally sound and which should be avoided. He found the main electrical panel, long since dead, and explained what it would take to get even partial power restored. "You're talking thousands of dollars in professional work," he said bluntly, "but for now, the generator will keep you from freezing." He also located the installation's old water system, a network of pipes connected to a well that had been dug when the base was active. "If the well's not dry, and if the pump still works, you might be able to get water flowing," he said. "That's a big if, though. I can't test it without power to the pump system." As evening approached, Linda and Joe prepared to leave. Linda hugged Sarah tightly, and for a moment, her professional composure cracked. "Please be careful," she whispered. "Please don't let pride or stubbornness keep you here if it becomes dangerous. Promise me you'll reach out if you need help." "I will," Sarah promised, though they both knew the nearest help was 2 hours away. Joe shook her hand, his grip firm. "You've got guts, Mrs. Mitchell. Stupid guts, maybe, but guts nonetheless. I'll check on you in a week, bring some fuel for the generator. Until then, conserve everything. Stay warm and don't take any risks you don't have to." Then they were gone, their car disappearing down the overgrown access road, and Sarah was left standing in the entrance of the installation with Daniel in her arms, staring at the dimming light filtering through the broken windows. Silence settled around them like a heavy blanket, broken only by the wind, whistling through cracks in the walls and the distant sound of something, maybe a tree branch, scraping against the roof. Sarah carried Daniel back to their room and settled him on the makeshift bed, surrounding him with blankets to ward off the chill that was already seeping into the concrete bones of the building. She fired up the generator, wincing at the loud rumble that shattered the quiet, and plugged in a space heater that threw a weak orange glow into the room. It wasn't much, but it was warmth. That first night was the longest of Sarah's life. Every sound seemed magnified in the darkness, footsteps that were probably just the building settling, whispers that were only the wind, creaks and groans that her exhausted mind wanted to interpret as threats. She lay beside Daniel on the narrow bed, one arm around him, listening to him breathe, and wondered if she had just made the worst mistake of her life. But when morning came, filtering weak gray light through their small window, and Daniel woke with his crooked smile, reaching for her with his bent fingers, she felt the fear recede just slightly. They had survived the first night. That had to count for something. The days that followed established a brutal routine. Sarah woke before dawn, conserving the generator's fuel by limiting their use of the heater to early morning and evening hours. She had brought a manual camping stove, and she cooked simple meals: oatmeal, canned soup, rice, and beans. Water was a constant concern. Joe had left them several large containers filled, but she knew they'd run out soon. And she would have to solve the well problem or start hauling water from the nearest town, a prospect that seemed impossible without a car. Daniel's care remained her primary focus. She bathed him with warmed water heated on the camp stove, using a basin and gentle cloths. She administered his medications on schedule, a complicated regimen that couldn't be missed. She did his daily stretches and exercises, the physical therapy routines that kept his muscles from atrophying further, talking to him constantly, singing songs, telling stories, trying to keep his spirits up even as her own threatened to break. During the hours when Daniel napped or rested quietly, Sarah explored the installation more systematically. She needed to understand this place, needed to know what resources might be hidden in its depths, what dangers lurked in its shadows. She moved carefully through corridor after corridor, her flashlight revealing rooms that held nothing but rust and dust, and other rooms that spoke of the installation's former life. A cafeteria with overturned tables, a rec room with a broken pool table, offices with filing cabinets, whose drawers hung open like mouths frozen mid-scream. It was during one of these explorations, nearly a week into their new life at the installation, that Sarah's flashlight beam fell across something she had missed before. She was in the main corridor, checking a directory panel she'd glanced at previously, when she noticed a stairwell she hadn't descended. The sign above it read, "Level B, authorized personnel only," with faded red lettering that had once meant something. Her heart quickened. The storage level mentioned on the directory had been marked as restricted access. Could this be it? The stairs descended into deeper darkness, the air growing colder and danker as she moved down. The metal railing was rough with rust under her palm. At the bottom, she found a heavy door, closed, but not locked. She pushed it open, the hinges protesting, and stepped into a space that felt different from the rest of the installation. This level was smaller, more cramped, with lower ceilings and narrower corridors. The walls here were reinforced with extra layers of concrete, thick and imposing. Sarah's flashlight swept across signs that read, "Archive Storage, Equipment Reserves," and at the far end of the corridor, barely visible, "Vault, Command Access Only." Vault. The word sent electricity through her tired body. Why would a radar installation need a vault? What would they have stored here that required that level of security? She moved toward the vault door, her footsteps echoing strangely in the confined space. When her light finally illuminated it fully, she understood why this door had survived intact, while so much else had fallen apart. It was massive, round, like something from a bank or a submarine, with a central wheel mechanism and what looked like a combination lock panel that had probably been state-of-the-art in 1965, but now looked like a relic from another world. The metal was thick, scarred, but not rusted, designed to withstand far more than time and neglect. Sarah stood before it, her breath visible in the cold air of the underground level, and felt something stir inside her that had been dormant for weeks. Curiosity, not the desperate, survival-focused calculations that had consumed every waking moment since arriving here, but genuine wonder about what might lie beyond that sealed door. She approached slowly, running her hand along the cold metal surface. The combination dial was marked with numbers 0 through 99, the kind of old mechanical system that predated digital security. Beside it was a small placard, tarnished, but still readable. Authorized access required. Class 3 security clearance. Unauthorized entry punishable under military code. Sarah almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Military code. She was a homeless woman squatting in an abandoned installation with a disabled child. What were they going to do? Court-martial her? She tried the wheel handle experimentally, knowing it wouldn't budge, and it didn't. The door was locked tight, the combination the only key that would open it. She stood there for a long moment, her mind working through possibilities. Colonel Webb had owned this property. Had he known about this vault? Had he ever tried to open it? The letter from the lawyer hadn't mentioned anything about restricted areas or sealed spaces. But then, the property transfer had been handled as a simple real estate transaction. No one had done a thorough inventory of the installation's contents. It was supposed to be demolished. Why would they bother cataloging what was behind a locked vault door? Sarah made her way back upstairs, her mind churning with questions. Daniel was awake when she returned to their room, his eyes tracking her movements as she entered. She forced a smile, not wanting her preoccupation to worry him. "Hey, baby," she said softly, kneeling beside the bed. "How are you feeling? Are you warm enough?" He made a sound, his version of yes, and reached for her hand. She held his twisted fingers gently, marveling as always at the strength of spirit contained in such a fragile body. "I found something interesting downstairs," she told him, partly because she needed to say it aloud, and partly because talking to Daniel, even when he couldn't answer in words, helped her think. "A big locked door. A vault, I think. I wonder what's inside." Daniel's eyes widened slightly, his expression curious. He loved stories, loved mysteries. Sarah had spent countless nights in the shelter making up adventures to tell him, tales of hidden treasures and brave explorers, never imagining she might be living one herself. "Nah, I'm going to figure out how to open it," she continued, her voice growing more determined as she spoke. "There might be something useful inside, or maybe just old records and equipment. But either way, I want to know." Over the following days, Sarah became consumed with the vault. Joe had returned as promised, bringing fuel for the generator and bags of groceries he insisted were extras from his own shopping, though Sarah suspected he'd bought them specifically for her and Daniel. When she mentioned the vault to him, his weathered face grew thoughtful. Vaults in these installations usually held classified documents, backup communication equipment, sometimes emergency supplies, he said. During the Cold War, they prepared for every scenario, including being cut off from command for extended periods. Could be anything in there, or nothing at all. Depends on whether they cleared it out before decommissioning. "How would I figure out the combination?" Sarah asked. Joe scratched his jaw. "That's tricky. Official combinations would have been held by commanding officers, changed regularly for security. When a base shut down, they were supposed to either remove everything sensitive or destroy the combination records. But people are lazy, and bureaucracy is messy. Sometimes combinations got written down in maintenance logs, hidden in personnel files, that sort of thing. Where would those files be? If they exist, probably still here somewhere. They were supposed to archive everything, but a lot of times they just left the non-critical paperwork behind when they cleared out. Storage rooms, administrative offices, anywhere they kept records." Sarah felt a spark of hope. It was a long shot, But it was something, a direction. She had nothing but time, trapped in this installation with limited ability to go anywhere else, dependent on Joe's weekly visits for supplies. Searching for the combination would at least give her a purpose beyond mere survival. She began systematically exploring every office and storage room on the upper levels, searching for filing cabinets, desk drawers, anywhere documents might have been left behind. Most of what she found was useless. Procurement forms for spare parts ordered decades ago. Personnel rosters with names of men and women long since retired or dead. Maintenance schedules for equipment that no longer existed. But she kept searching, driven by a stubbornness that had kept her alive through the worst months of her life. Daniel accompanied her when he could, strapped to her back in a carrier she'd fashioned from old blankets and rope, his weight slight enough that she could manage it for short periods. Other times, she left him in their room, surrounded by blankets, and with a walkie-talkie Joe had brought, so she could check on him while she explored. Every hour, she would return to him, making sure he was warm, fed, comfortable, loved. The work was exhausting. Sarah was already pushing her body past its limits, surviving on too little food and too little sleep, her hands cracked and bleeding from the cold, her muscles aching from carrying Daniel and navigating the maze of corridors. But the vault called to her, a mystery that felt like it might hold answers, or at least distraction from the grinding reality of their situation. It was in an administrative office on the second week of searching that she found the first real clue. The room had clearly belonged to someone important, larger than the others, with a window that overlooked the installation's grounds. The desk was massive, metal like everything else, with drawers that had been left unlocked. Most contained nothing of interest. But in the bottom drawer, pushed to the very back, Sarah's flashlight illuminated a leather journal, its cover cracked with age. She pulled it out carefully, her heart beating faster. The first page bore a name written in neat handwriting. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hayes, Installation Commander. Below that, a date. 1962 to 1968. Sarah flipped through the pages, squinting at the cramped writing. So much of it was mundane. Notes about personnel issues, weather reports, complaints about supply deliveries. But scattered throughout were entries that suggested something more. References to the project and classified materials and secure storage protocols. One entry, dated November 1967, caught her attention. Vault combination changed per quarterly schedule. New sequence filed with base security and recorded in primary access log. Must ensure backup documentation maintained in case of command transfer. Primary access log. Sarah's pulse quickened. If such a log existed, and if it hadn't been destroyed, it might contain the vault combination. She kept reading, looking for any mention of where this log might be kept. Several pages later, she found it. Access logs stored in Security Office, Level A, Room 24, on redundant copies in base archives. Sarah felt a surge of excitement so powerful it nearly made her dizzy. She had a location. Room 24 on this level. She could find that. She marked the page with a scrap of paper and hurried back to Daniel, needing to share her discovery even though he couldn't fully understand. "I found something," she told him breathlessly, showing him the journal, though he couldn't read the faded writing. "I think I know how to open the vault. I just need to find one more thing." The security office proved easier to locate than she'd expected. Most doors in the installation were marked with their room numbers, faded but still visible. Room 24 was in the administrative wing, its door hanging loose on broken hinges. Inside, Sarah found what had clearly once been a secure workspace. The walls had extra reinforcement, and there was evidence of a lock system on the door that had been removed during decommissioning. Metal filing cabinets lined 2 walls. Most had been emptied, their drawers pulled out and left gaping. But one cabinet in the corner, partially hidden behind a collapsed ceiling panel, was still closed. Sarah pulled the debris away and tried the drawers. Locked. She stood back, frustration welling up. She had come so far, found the journal, located the office. She couldn't let a locked filing cabinet stop her now. Using a crowbar from Joe's toolbox, Sarah pried at the cabinet's lock. The metal was old but sturdy, resisting her efforts. She sweated and strained, her arms trembling with effort, until finally, the lock mechanism broke with a sharp crack that echoed through the room. The drawer slid open. Inside were files, dozens of them, organized in folders with labels like personnel records, security protocols, emergency procedures. And there, in a red folder marked restricted access, vault operations, Sarah found what she'd been searching for. The access log was a thick ledger, its pages filled with dates, names, and strings of numbers. Each entry recorded when the vault combination was changed, who authorized the change, and what the new combination was. Sarah's hands shook as she flipped to the final entries, dated from just before the installation was decommissioned in 1968. The last combination change was listed as October 15th, 1968. Final vault seal per decommission protocol. Combination 37621184. Authorized by Lieutenant Colonel R. Hayes. Note: contents classified per National Security Directive, and vault to remain sealed pending future declassification or authorized retrieval. Sarah stared at the numbers, committing them to memory. 37, 62, 11, 84. 4 numbers that might unlock whatever secrets the installation had been built to protect. She practically ran back to their quarters, clutching the ledger against her chest. Daniel was napping, curled under blankets, his breathing steady and peaceful. Sarah kissed his forehead gently, whispering, "Mama's going to try something. I'll be right back. I love you." The descent to the lower level felt different this time, charged with anticipation. When Sarah reached the vault door, she stood before it for a moment, the ledger open in her hands, double-checking the numbers. Then she reached for the combination dial. Her fingers, cold and slightly numb, Ma turned the dial with careful precision. Right to 37. Left past 37 to 62. Right to 11. Left to 84. Each movement felt significant, weighted with possibility. When the final number aligned, Sarah held her breath and tried the wheel handle. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The door remained sealed, and despair threatened to swallow her. Then she heard it. A soft click, deep within the door's mechanism. The sound of locks disengaging, of seals releasing after 57 years of silence. The wheel turned under her hands. Sarah pulled, and the massive door swung outward with surprising smoothness, its hinges well made enough to function even after decades. Cold air rushed out from the space beyond, carrying with it a scent that was different from the rest of the installation. Drier, more sterile, as if the vault had been sealed so tightly that even air couldn't enter or escape. Her flashlight beam cut into the darkness, revealing a space larger than she'd expected. The vault wasn't just a single room. It was a chamber, maybe 15 feet by 20, with metal shelving lining the walls and several large containers stacked in the center. Sarah stepped inside, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The beam of her flashlight swept across the shelves, illuminating rows of boxes, filing containers, and several items covered with protective tarps. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust, undisturbed for over half a century. She moved to the nearest shelf and carefully pulled down one of the boxes. It was marked with dates and reference numbers that meant nothing to her. Inside, she found files, on documents stamped with Classified, in red ink. Reports about things she didn't understand. Radar capabilities, missile trajectories, Soviet satellite tracking. The next box contained similar documents. And the next. The vault had been exactly what Joe suggested. A storage space for classified materials that the military had sealed rather than destroyed or removed when the installation closed. Sarah's initial excitement began to fade. Old classified documents might be historically interesting, but they wouldn't help her current situation. They wouldn't feed Daniel, wouldn't power the generator, wouldn't make their lives easier. She was about to give up and leave when her flashlight beam fell across something different at the back of the vault. Unlike the metal shelving and cardboard boxes, this was a wooden crate, larger than the others, with metal bands reinforcing its corners. Stenciled on its side in faded paint were words that made Sarah's breath catch. Emergency reserve, do not open except by direct command authorization. Sarah approached it slowly, a strange electricity building in her chest. The crate was secured with a simple hasp lock, the kind that could be broken easily. Whatever security this crate had required, it had been in being inside the vault, not in the crate's own lock. She used her crowbar again, this time easily prying the hasp free. The lid of the crate lifted with a creak of old wood. Inside, nestled in straw packing material that crumbled at her touch, were metal cases, each about the size of a briefcase, with combination locks of their own. Sarah pulled one out and set it on the floor of the vault. The lock was simpler than the vault door, just a 3-digit combination. She tried a few random numbers without success, then, on impulse, tried variations of the vault combination. On her third attempt, using the first 3 digits, 376211, the lock clicked open. She lifted the lid of the case, and her entire world stopped. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, were gold bars. Not large ones, but gold nonetheless, each about the size of a deck of cards, stamped with official markings that identified them as U.S. government property, minted decades ago. There were 6 bars in this case alone. Sarah's hands trembled as she touched one, lifting it carefully. It was heavy, far heavier than its size suggested, the weight of pure gold. Her mind couldn't process what she was seeing. Why would a radar installation have gold bars in its vault? She opened another case, more gold. A third case. This one contained bundles of cash, old bills whose denominations made her eyes widen. Hundreds, thousands, stacks of them, wrapped in paper bands that had yellowed with age, but kept the bills pristine. The fourth case. Diamonds. Actual diamonds, in small velvet pouches, each stone loose and uncut, but clearly valuable even to her untrained eye. Beside them were other gemstones, rubies, emeralds, sapphires, all stored with the clinical precision of government inventory. Sarah sat back on her heels, her flashlight clattering to the floor, its beam shooting wild patterns across the vault ceiling. Her mind reeled, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. But the weight of the gold bar still in her hand told her otherwise. The rough texture of the bills, the glint of the diamonds in her flashlight beam, all of it was undeniably, impossibly real. She forced herself to breathe, to think. Why would these things be here? What possible reason could the military have for storing gold, cash, and gemstones in a radar installation's vault? And then, as her racing thoughts began to settle, pieces started falling into place. The Cold War, the constant preparation for nuclear attack, for the breakdown of society, for scenarios where normal banking and currency might become worthless or inaccessible. The military had prepared for everything, including the need to fund operations if the regular financial system collapsed. This wasn't just storage. This was an emergency reserve, exactly as the crate had said. Money and portable wealth that could be used to pay personnel, purchase supplies, or bribe allies in a post-apocalyptic scenario that, thank God, had never come to pass. When the installation closed, someone had either forgotten about this reserve or decided the paperwork and security required to retrieve and account for it wasn't worth the effort. So they'd sealed the vault, recorded the contents as classified, and walked away. For 57 years, a fortune had sat in this underground chamber, waiting. And now, Sarah Mitchell, homeless mother with $300 to her name, was sitting in a vault surrounded by more wealth than she could comprehend. She didn't move for a long time. She couldn't. The magnitude of what she'd found paralyzed her with a mixture of disbelief, fear, and hope, so intense it felt like drowning and breathing at the same time. Finally, her son's face filled her mind. Daniel, upstairs in their cold room, wrapped in blankets because they couldn't afford to run the heater more than a few hours a day. Daniel, who needed therapies and medications and a warm home and a future that didn't involve growing up on a shelter floor or in a freezing military installation. Sarah stood, her legs unsteady. She carefully returned the gold bar to its case and closed the lid. Then she moved systematically through the wooden crate, counting. 12 cases total, some with gold, some with cash, some with gemstones. She didn't dare try to calculate the value. It was too much, too overwhelming. She took just one case, the smallest one with gold bars, and left the vault, sealing the door behind her. The combination lock clicked back into place. To anyone else, it would look untouched, unopened, and exactly as it had been for decades. Sarah climbed the stairs back to the main level, the case heavy in her arms, her mind spinning with possibilities and problems in equal measure. She couldn't just walk into a bank with government-minted gold bars from 1965. She couldn't deposit $100 bills that predated modern security features. She couldn't sell loose diamonds without raising questions about where a homeless woman had acquired them. But she also couldn't ignore what she'd found, couldn't pretend the vault was still locked, the fortune still sealed away. Because with that wealth, carefully and quietly accessed, she could change everything. She could give Daniel the life he deserved. When she returned to their room, Daniel was awake, his eyes finding her immediately. Sarah set the case down carefully and sat beside him on the bed, her hand still shaking. "Baby," she whispered, tears suddenly streaming down her face. "Everything's going to be okay. I promise. Everything's going to be okay." He reached for her face with his bent fingers, touching her tears with the gentle concern that always broke her heart. She caught his hand and kissed it, laughing through her crying, overwhelmed by relief and fear and the terrifying responsibility of what she'd discovered. That night, after Daniel fell asleep, Sarah opened the case again by the light of a battery-powered lamp. She counted the gold bars, 6 of them, each stamped with its weight, 100 grams. She did the math in her head based on gold prices she vaguely remembered from news reports. Even at conservative estimates, these 6 bars alone were worth close to $30,000, and there were 11 more cases in the vault. The full scope of what she'd found, when she finally allowed herself to calculate it, made her physically ill with shock. The gold alone was worth hundreds of thousands. The cash, if it could be authenticated and exchanged, might be worth its face value, or more as collectibles. The gemstones were impossible to value without an expert, but even one diamond could be worth thousands. Conservatively, very conservatively, Sarah was looking at several $1 million. Maybe more, maybe much more. She sat in the darkness, one hand on Daniel's sleeping form, the other resting on the case of gold bars, and felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. This should have been the answer to every prayer, the miracle she'd been desperate for. But instead, it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that one wrong step would send her plummeting, because she had no idea how to turn this discovery into actual help, no idea how to access this wealth without raising alarms, without having it seized as government property, without ending up in legal trouble that would destroy what little stability she'd managed to create for Daniel. The fortune in the vault was real, but it might as well have been behind glass, untouchable, a cruel tease to someone who had nothing. Sarah pulled a blanket around her shoulders and stared at the case of gold bars until her eyes burned. Somewhere in her exhausted mind, a plan began to form. It was risky. It would require patience and careful steps. But she had nothing to lose. She'd already lost everything that could be taken from her. All she had now was a disabled son who needed her, a fortune hidden in a Cold War bunker, and the desperate determination of a mother who would do anything, risk anything, to give her child a future. The vault had revealed its secret. Now Sarah had to figure out how to use it without destroying everything in the process. Dawn came slowly, filtering gray light through their small window. Sarah hadn't slept. She'd spent the hours turning the problem over in her mind, considering and discarding a dozen plans. By the time Daniel woke, she had settled on a first step. She needed help. Not from someone in authority, not from the system that had already failed them. She needed someone who understood how to navigate in the shadows, on how to turn things of value into usable resources without attracting unwanted attention. She needed Joe. When he arrived for his weekly check-in 3 days later, bringing supplies and fuel, Sarah asked him to stay after he'd unloaded everything. They sat in the installation's old cafeteria, a space Sarah had partially cleaned, while Daniel napped in their room nearby. "I need to tell you something," Sarah said, her voice low. "And I need you to listen before you judge me or tell me what I should do." Joe's weathered face remained neutral. "All right." She told him about the vault, about the combination she'd found, about opening the door, about what was inside. As she spoke, she watched his expression shift from curiosity to disbelief to something like awe. "Government emergency reserves," he said softly when she finished. I'd heard rumors that some installations had them, but I never saw one myself. They were above my clearance level. It's real, Joe. I saw it. I have some of it upstairs." He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Sarah, do you understand what kind of situation this puts you in? That's government property. Technically, you could be prosecuted for theft." "I know," she said. "But Joe, that property has been forgotten for over 50 years. The installation was supposed to be demolished. If I hadn't bought it for $1, if I hadn't explored it, that vault would have been destroyed with the building, and everything in it lost forever. The government wrote it off decades ago." "Maybe," Joe conceded, "but the law doesn't always care about logic. If someone finds out, if this gets reported, you could lose everything, including Daniel." Sarah met his eyes, her gaze steady despite the fear she felt. "I'm going to lose Daniel anyway if I can't provide for him. I'm living in a freezing bunker with no power and no running water. I'm rationing food and fuel. I can't get him to his doctors or therapists. How long before someone from child services decides I'm unfit? How long before they take him away because I can't give him what he needs?" The words hung in the cold air between them. Joe said nothing, but his silence was acknowledgement. She was right, and they both knew it. "I'm not asking you to do anything illegal," Sarah continued. "I'm asking you to help me think through how to use this carefully, quietly, in a way that doesn't raise red flags. You know people. You've lived a long time, seen a lot. So you must know someone who could help me convert some of this into usable money without it becoming a federal case." Joe was quiet for a long time, his fingers drumming on the table's scarred surface. Finally, he spoke. "I know a guy. Retired from the service around the same time I did. He deals in collectibles now, estate sales, that sort of thing. He's discreet, asks minimal questions, and he's helped people liquidate unusual items before. If anyone could convert some of that gold or cash without raising flags, it would be him. Can you introduce me?" "I can." Joe's voice was heavy with caution. "But Sarah, you need to be smart about this. Don't try to move everything at once. Small amounts, spread over time. Nothing that would trigger reporting requirements or draw attention. And for God's sake, don't tell anyone else about the vault. Not Linda, not your family, not anyone. The fewer people who know, the safer you are." Sarah nodded, relief flooding through her. She wasn't alone in this. She had an ally, someone who understood the stakes and was willing to help her navigate the impossible situation she'd found herself in. "Thank you," she whispered. Joe reached across the table and squeezed her hand briefly. "Don't thank me yet. This is a dangerous game you're playing, but I understand why you're playing it." He paused, then added, "For what it's worth, I think you've got more guts than sense, but I respect the hell out of you for fighting for that boy." 2 days later, Joe returned with his friend, a man named Marcus, who looked like someone's grandfather, silver-haired and gentle-faced, with reading glasses perched on his nose. But his eyes, when they examined the single gold bar Sarah showed him, were sharp and calculating. "Government mint, 1964, Marcus said, turning the bar in his hands. 100 grams. These were part of the Strategic Reserves program. Interesting piece of history you have here." "Can you help me?" Sarah asked directly. Marcus set the bar down carefully. "I can pay you 70% of market value. Cash, no paperwork, no questions. That's my standard fee for items where discretion is important. For this bar, that would be approximately $21,000. Sarah's breath caught. $21,000. For one bar, and she had dozens more in the vault. "When?" she managed to ask. "I'll need 3 days to arrange the liquid cash. After that, whenever you want to conduct another transaction, give me a week's notice." "But Mrs. Mitchell," Marcus looked at her seriously. "I'll work with you once a month, maximum. Anything more frequent raises questions, creates patterns. And I need you to understand that what we're doing exists in a legal gray area. You're not technically stealing, since you own the property where these items were found. But the government could argue otherwise if they wanted to. Discretion is paramount." "I understand," Sarah said, though her hands were shaking. "Once a month, one item at a time." They shook hands, and Marcus left with the gold bar, promising to return in 3 days. Sarah spent those days in a state of nervous anticipation that made it nearly impossible to eat or sleep. What if Marcus didn't return? What if he reported her? What if this was all a trap? But on the 3rd day, as promised, he arrived with Joe. They met in the cafeteria again, and Marcus handed Sarah an envelope. Inside was cash, counted out in $100 bills. $21,000. Sarah stared at the money, more cash than she'd ever seen in her entire life, and felt tears streaming down her face. This was real. It was actually happening. "Thank you," she whispered. Marcus nodded. "Take care of yourself and your boy. Next month, if you need me again, call Joe. He'll have a way to reach me." After Marcus left, Sarah sat alone in the cafeteria with the envelope of cash, her entire body trembling. This was just the beginning. One gold bar out of dozens. One transaction out of many that could follow. But it was proof that the impossible was possible, that the fortune in the vault could actually change their lives. The first thing she bought was heat. Real, reliable heat. She hired a contractor to install a wood-burning stove in their room, and had cords of firewood delivered. For the first time since arriving at the installation, Sarah and Daniel could be truly warm, not just for a few hours a day, but constantly. She watched Daniel's color improve almost immediately, watched him relax in a way he hadn't been able to when they were always fighting the cold. Next came food. Real food. Fresh fruits and vegetables, meat, milk, bread that wasn't stale. Sarah cooked meals that made Daniel's eyes light up, meals that filled them both properly for the first time in months. She'd been rationing for so long, making every dollar stretch impossibly far, that the simple act of buying groceries without calculating every penny felt almost sinful. But she was careful. She didn't splurge. She didn't draw attention. She shopped at different stores, paid cash, and never bought so much at once that anyone would wonder where a woman living in an abandoned bunker was getting her money. The following month, she met with Marcus again, this time bringing one of the bundles of old cash from the vault. He examined the bills carefully, noting their dates and conditions. "These are actually worth more than face value to collectors," he told her. "I can get you 120% of the printed amount. For this bundle, that's about $14,000. $14,000 for bills, whose face value was $12,000. Sarah felt dizzy with the mathematics of it. Every transaction was turning her discovery into real, usable money. With that money, she bought a used car, so a reliable older model that wouldn't attract attention, but would give her mobility. She could drive to town now, take Daniel to medical appointments, not be trapped in isolation. The first time she drove Daniel away from the installation and saw his face pressed against the window. Watching the world go by, she cried. The third month brought another gold bar transaction, more money in her account, carefully distributed across different hiding places. She used it to hire an electrician to restore power to a section of the installation, just their living quarters and a few adjacent rooms. She told him she'd inherited money from a relative, which was technically true. He didn't ask many questions, just did the work. And suddenly they had lights, real lights, and outlets to plug things into. Sarah bought Daniel a television and something to entertain him during the long hours when she was working on the installation. She set it up in their room, now properly heated and lit, and watched his face transform with joy as cartoons played across the screen. It was such a small thing, something most children took for granted. But for Daniel, who had spent months with nothing but his mother's stories and a few old toys, it was magic. She also, carefully and quietly, began to restore the installation itself. Not dramatically, not in ways that would attract attention from anyone driving past, but internally, making it genuinely livable. She sealed cracks, repaired walls, replaced broken windows in their section of the building. She hired workers for day jobs, paying cash, telling them she was slowly renovating the property herself. By the fourth month, their living space had transformed from a desperate shelter into an actual home. Still stark, still industrial in its bones, but warm, safe, and comfortable. Daniel had his own room now, painted bright blue because that was his favorite color, with a real bed and soft blankets and toys arranged on shelves Sarah had installed. He had adapted to their new life with the resilience of children, seeming to understand that something fundamental had changed, that the constant fear and scarcity had lifted. Sarah was careful to maintain appearances when anyone visited. She kept the vault sealed, never mentioned it, never hinted at its existence. The restoration of the installation was explained as slow, careful work, funded by savings and credit, nothing that would raise eyebrows. Joe was the only person who knew the truth, and he kept her secret absolutely, checking in weekly, helping with heavy work, becoming something like a father figure to both Sarah and Daniel. 6 months after finding the vault, Sarah's transformation was becoming impossible to hide completely. She'd gained weight back, no longer gaunt with hunger and stress. Her hands had healed. Her face had lost the desperate edge that had made her look 10 years older than she was. She moved with confidence instead of the defeated shuffle of someone beaten down by circumstances. And people noticed. Linda, the caseworker, came to visit one afternoon, making the long drive out to check on them as she'd promised. When Sarah opened the door to their quarters, warm air spilling out, lights visible behind her, Linda's mouth fell open in shock. "Sarah?" she said uncertainly, as if doubting this was the same woman she'd helped move into a freezing ruin half a year ago. "Come in," Sarah said, smiling. "Let me show you what we've done with the place." Linda stepped inside and stopped, looking around in disbelief. The room was clean, organized, comfortable. A wood stove radiated heat. Daniel was playing on a soft rug with toys, his wheelchair parked nearby, but his needs clearly being met. There was food in containers on shelves, clothes hung neatly, battery-powered lamps providing soft light. "How?" Linda breathed. "Sarah, how did you do this? When you left the shelter, I thought. I was so worried." "I worked," Sarah said simply. "I found odd jobs, saved every penny, and put it all into making this place work. It's not easy, but we're making it." It was a lie built on truth. She had worked, impossibly hard. Not for money, but to make the installation livable. The money had come from elsewhere, but the effort was real enough that the lie felt almost honest. Linda walked through the space, touching walls, examining the improvements, and Sarah could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. The caseworker was trying to figure out how much all this would have cost, whether Sarah's story made sense, but ultimately, she seemed to decide that it didn't matter. What mattered was that Sarah and Daniel were safe, warm, and thriving. "I owe you an apology," Linda said quietly when they returned to the main room. "I didn't think you could do this. I thought this place would break you. But you've actually done it." "We're not done yet," Sarah replied. "But we're getting there." After Linda left, Sarah sat with Daniel, holding him close. The caseworker's visit had been a test she'd passed. If Linda, who knew what Sarah had started with, could be convinced that this was all through legitimate hard work, then anyone could be. But her family would be harder. News of Sarah's situation had reached them through the strange networks that families maintained even when fractured. Her sister called, her voice tight with suspicion. "Linda said you're doing well out there, that the place is actually livable now." "It's coming together," Sarah said carefully. "How, Sarah? How are you affording renovations? Where are you getting money?" "I work. I'm careful with what I have. I make it stretch." "That's not an answer," her sister's voice sharpened. "Are you doing something illegal? Because if you are, if you're putting Daniel at risk—" "I'm putting Daniel at risk." Sarah's patience, one carefully maintained for months, finally cracked. "You who wouldn't even let us stay in your guest room? You who told me to give him up? You're worried about me putting him at risk?" Silence on the other end. "We're fine," Sarah continued, her voice hard. "We're better than fine. And we did it without your help, without anyone's help. So you can take your concern and your judgment and keep them to yourself." She hung up before her sister could respond, her hands shaking with anger and satisfaction in equal measure. Months ago, that conversation would have destroyed her. Now, it felt like closing a door that should have been shut long ago. Her father never called, but she heard through family channels that he'd dismissed her success as temporary and probably illegal. She didn't care anymore. His opinion had stopped mattering the moment he'd refused to help his own grandson. The person whose reaction mattered most unexpectedly appeared on a cold afternoon in the 8th month. Sarah was outside, chopping wood with an efficiency born of practice, when a car pulled up the access road. She didn't recognize it at first, not until the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. Her ex-husband, Daniel's father. The man who had walked out on them 2 years ago and never looked back. Sarah set down the axe slowly, her heart rate spiking. "What are you doing here?" He looked older, tired, his face carrying shame, and something that might have been regret. "I heard. Someone told me you were living out here, that you'd inherited some property. I wanted to see Daniel." "No." The word came out flat, absolute. "Sarah, please. He's my son. He was your son when you walked out on us. He was your son when we ended up in a homeless shelter. He was your son when I was choosing between his medication and food. Where were you then?" He flinched. I know I was wrong. I panicked. I couldn't handle his needs, the stress, the bills. I ran. I'm not proud of it. And now you're back because you heard I have property? Because you think there might be something in it for you?" His expression confirmed her suspicion before he even spoke. "I could help," he said weakly. "With Daniel, with expenses." Sarah walked toward him, her body language making him step back. "Get off my property. Daniel doesn't need you. He doesn't even remember you. You gave up the right to be his father when you abandoned us. Don't come back." "Sarah," I said, "get off my property, or I'll call the police and tell them you're trespassing." He stood there for a moment longer, seeming to wage some internal battle, then turned and walked back to his car. Sarah watched him drive away, her chest tight with fury and vindication. He'd left when they had nothing. He'd come crawling back when he thought they had something. It was proof, if she'd needed it, that she'd been right to trust no one but herself. That evening, as she tucked Daniel into his warm bed in his bright blue room, she whispered to him, "Your father came today. I sent him away. It's still just us, baby. Just us against the world. And we're winning." Daniel's crooked smile, the one that never failed to break and rebuild her heart simultaneously, was all the answer she needed. The months continued to pass, marked by careful transactions with Marcus, unsteady improvements to the installation, and gradual integration into a more stable life. Sarah hired a tutor to work with Daniel, someone who specialized in children with disabilities. She bought him proper therapy equipment, things that had been impossible to afford before. She watched him make progress, small gains that felt like mountains after months of regression. She also, very carefully, began to establish a financial identity that could withstand scrutiny. She claimed some of her income as coming from online freelance work, filing taxes on modest amounts, creating a paper trail that explained how she was surviving. The bulk of the fortune remained hidden, accessed slowly, but the visible portion was enough to justify their improved circumstances. A year after finding the vault, Aunt Sarah had transformed not just her living situation, but her entire existence. The installation was no longer a desperate shelter, but a functional home. She'd restored power to half the building, installed proper plumbing in their section, and created living spaces that were genuinely comfortable. Daniel had everything he needed: warmth, food, medical care, education, and love. But the vault still held most of its secrets. Sarah had only accessed a fraction of the fortune, maybe 5%. She'd been so careful, so measured, that the bulk of the wealth remained sealed behind that round door in the basement, waiting. She began to think about the future differently, not just survival, but legacy. What would she do with the rest of the fortune? She couldn't access it all without raising suspicions that would destroy everything. But she also couldn't let it sit unused forever, a wasted miracle. The answer came to her gradually, shaped by Daniel's needs and her own growing understanding of what mattered. She would create something permanent, something that would outlast both of them. A foundation, officially funded by inheritance from Colonel Webb, dedicated to helping disabled children and their families. She would funnel money into it slowly, legitimately, using lawyers and accountants to make it legal and proper. The fortune that had been hidden for 57 years, prepared for a war that never came, would instead fund a different kind of battle. The daily struggle of families like hers had been, families fighting for their children against systems that had failed them. It would take years to fully execute. But Sarah had time now. She had security, resources, and purpose. On the 1-year anniversary of opening the vault, Sarah did something she'd been planning for weeks. She invited Linda, Joe, and Marcus to dinner at the installation. She prepared a real meal, the kind of feast that required a dining table and good dishes, both of which she now owned. As they sat together in the former cafeteria, now transformed into a dining room with painted walls and proper lighting, Sarah looked around at the faces of the people who had helped her survive this impossible year. Joe, who had believed in her when no one else did. Marcus, who had given her a way to access the fortune without destroying everything. And Linda, who had tried to protect her even when she thought Sarah was making a terrible mistake. "I want to thank you," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "All of you. You saved us. You made this possible." "You saved yourself," Linda replied gently. "We just helped a little." After dinner, after the others had left, Sarah carried Daniel down to the vault. She hadn't brought him here before, hadn't wanted him near the source of their secret. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt like closing one chapter and beginning another. She opened the vault door with the combination she'd memorized, letting Daniel see inside for the first time. His eyes went wide at the sight of the remaining cases, the boxes, the carefully organized fortune. "This is our secret," she told him softly. "This is what changed everything. But Daniel, I need you to understand something. This money, all of this, it's not what matters. What matters is that we survived. What matters is that we fought when everyone said we couldn't. What matters is us." He reached for her face with his twisted fingers, and she caught his hand, kissing it. "I love you," she whispered. "More than all of this. More than anything." They stood together in the vault for a few moments longer. Then Sarah sealed it again, turning the wheel until the locks engaged. The fortune was there if they needed it, but it no longer defined them. 2 years after finding the vault, Sarah's foundation officially launched. It was small at first, just a few grants to families struggling with medical costs for disabled children. But it would grow, fed by careful liquidation of the vault's contents over decades, becoming something far larger than Sarah alone could ever be. The installation itself became a kind of haven, and Sarah rented out some of the restored sections to artists and craftspeople looking for affordable studio space, people who appreciated the building's strange history and industrial aesthetic. The rent income gave her legitimate funding that supplemented the foundation work. Daniel thrived. His disabilities didn't disappear. Cerebral palsy doesn't work that way. But with proper therapy, good nutrition, warmth, and stability, he made progress that the doctors called remarkable. He learned to communicate better, to use adaptive technology, to engage with the world in ways that had seemed impossible during their homeless months. And Sarah, who had started this journey as a desperate mother with nothing to lose, discovered that she'd gained more than she'd ever imagined. Not just money, though the fortune had made everything possible, but purpose, dignity, and the unshakable knowledge that she was capable of far more than anyone had believed. 3 years after opening the vault, Sarah received a letter. It came from the Department of Defense, and her heart nearly stopped when she saw the return address. Inside was a formal document, explaining that as part of an ongoing review of decommissioned properties, they had discovered records of Installation 7 and its classified vault. However, after reviewing ownership records, They had determined that the property and all its contents had been legally transferred to civilian hands as part of the decommissioning process. The government was formally disclaiming any interest in the property or its contents, citing the time elapsed and the change of ownership. In other words, she was in the clear. The fortune was legally hers. Sarah sat with the letter for a long time, laughing and crying in equal measure. She'd been so careful, so paranoid, and it turned out that the government had essentially written off the vault decades ago. They didn't want the headache of trying to reclaim it. That evening, she called Joe. "It's official," she said. "The government doesn't want it. It's mine. We're safe." His warm laugh came through the phone. "You were always safe, Sarah. You just didn't know it yet. You did good, kid. You did real good." 5 years after finding the vault, Sarah was interviewed by a local newspaper for a feature on adaptive housing and disability support. The reporter asked how she'd managed to transform the installation into such a functional space. "Stubbornness," Sarah answered honestly, "and the belief that my son deserved better than what the world was offering him. Everything else followed from that." The article included a photo of Sarah and Daniel in front of the installation, both smiling. Daniel was bigger now, still in his wheelchair, but healthy and happy. Sarah looked confident, capable, nothing like the desperate woman who had signed papers for $1 5 years earlier. Her sister saw the article. She called, her voice small. "Sarah, I saw the newspaper. You look amazing. Daniel looks amazing." "We're doing well," Sarah said neutrally. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. For not helping, for judging you, for all of it. I was wrong." Sarah took a long breath. Forgiveness was hard, but holding on to anger was harder. "Thank you for saying that. We're okay now. But I won't forget what happened. And I won't forget who helped us and who didn't." It wasn't reconciliation, not really. But it was closure, and that was enough. Her father never apologized. She heard he'd told people he'd always known she'd land on her feet, rewriting history to make himself less of a villain. Sarah didn't bother correcting the record. His opinion had stopped mattering years ago. 7 years after finding the vault, Daniel turned 14. He'd grown into a remarkable young man, his mind sharp despite his body's limitations, his personality shining through in ways that made everyone who met him understand why Sarah had fought so hard. He used a computer with adaptive equipment to create digital art, some of which Sarah had framed and hung throughout the installation. For his birthday, Sarah did something she'd been planning for months. She took him on a trip, a real vacation to the ocean. It was his first time seeing the sea and watching his face as he looked out at the endless water. Sarah felt every sacrifice, every risk, every sleepless night of the past 7 years validated. "Thank you, Mom," Daniel said, his words clearer now after years of speech therapy but still requiring effort. "For everything. For never giving up." "I never could have given up on you," Sarah replied, her vision blurring with tears. "You're the reason I'm still fighting." 10 years after opening the vault, Sarah stood in the installation's entrance hall, now fully restored and beautiful in its stark, industrial way. The foundation she'd created had grown beyond anything she'd imagined, helping hundreds of families, funding research into adaptive technologies, providing grants for medical care. The vault itself was nearly empty now. She'd liquidated almost everything over the decade, carefully, legally, building a legacy that would continue long after she was gone. A few pieces remained, kept as memories more than resources. One gold bar, sealed in a frame on her office wall. A single old bill, similarly preserved. The journal that had led her to the combination, now a treasured artifact of their journey. Daniel was 17 now, preparing to start online college courses in graphic design. His physical limitations hadn't changed, but the world had changed around him. Technology and support systems making things possible that had seemed impossible when they'd lived in a homeless shelter. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found the vault?" he asked her one evening. The two of them sitting in their comfortable living room, the space warm and filled with light. Sarah considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But honestly, Daniel, I think we would have made it anyway. Maybe not to this," she gestured at their surroundings. "But we would have survived. The vault gave us resources, but the real treasure was already here." She touched his face gently. "It was you. You're what I was fighting for. The money just made the fight easier." He smiled, that crooked, beautiful smile that still broke her heart in the best way. "You're sappy, Mom." "I'm honest," she corrected. "There's a difference." That night, after Daniel had gone to bed, Sarah made one final trip to the vault. She opened it with the combination she would never forget, stepped inside the nearly empty chamber, and looked around at the space that had changed everything. She thought about the men who had sealed this fortune away 57 years ago, preparing for a catastrophe that never came. She thought about Colonel Webb, who'd bought the property and never opened this door, never knew what he'd owned. She thought about herself, desperate and homeless, signing papers for $1 because she had nothing left to lose. And she thought about the fortune that had been hidden here, waiting through decades for someone who needed it badly enough to risk everything to claim it. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty vault, to the ghosts of Cold War soldiers, to whatever force of fate or chance had led her here. "Thank you for not giving up on us." She sealed the vault one last time, turning the wheel until the locks engaged. The door would stay closed now. There was nothing left inside except dust and memory. But that was okay. She didn't need what was in the vault anymore. She had Daniel. She had a home. She had purpose. She had proven to herself and to the world that a homeless mother with a disabled son and $1 to her name could fight her way to stability, dignity, and hope. The radar installation had been built to detect threats from the sky, to watch for enemies that never came. But it had ended up protecting something far more important, a family who had nowhere else to go. As Sarah climbed the stairs back to the main level, leaving the vault sealed in the darkness below, she felt the weight of the past decade settle into something like peace. They had survived. More than that, they had thrived. The bunker that everyone had called worthless, the decision that everyone had called crazy, the hope that everyone had called delusional, all of it had been vindicated. And Sarah Mitchell, who had started with nothing but love for her son and the stubborn refusal to give up, had built something that would outlast them both. 15 years after that first desperate night in the installation, Sarah stood at a podium in a city convention center, addressing a crowd of advocates, families, and policymakers at a disability rights conference. The foundation she'd created had become nationally recognized, and she'd been invited to speak about supporting families in crisis. "I know what it's like to have nowhere to turn," she told the audience, her voice steady and strong. "I know what it's like when systems fail, when family abandons you, when you're making choices no one should have to make. But I also know that even in the darkest moments, even when it seems impossible, there is always a path forward. You just have to be brave enough, stubborn enough, to find it." The audience applauded, but Sarah wasn't finished. "People ask me how I did it," she continued. "How I took a condemned building and turned it into a home. How I provided for my son when I had nothing. They want a formula, a secret. But the truth is simpler than that. I did it because giving up wasn't an option. I did it because my son deserved a future. And I did it because I refused to let anyone tell me what was possible." More applause, stronger this time. "Whatever you're facing," Sarah said, looking out at the crowd where she knew other parents, other fighters, other survivors sat. "Whatever seems impossible right now, and remember this: You are stronger than you think. You are more capable than anyone gives you credit for. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the universe has a surprise waiting for you. You just have to be willing to look for it. Later, as people approached to thank her, to share their own stories, to ask for advice, Sarah felt the full weight of what the vault's fortune had made possible. Not just her own salvation, but the ripple effects spreading outward, helping others, creating change that would continue long after the money ran out. Daniel, now 22, and working as a graphic designer from home, had come to hear her speak. He maneuvered his electric wheelchair through the crowd to her side, pride evident in his face. "You killed it, Mom," he said. "We killed it," she corrected. "This was always about us. It's about what we built together." That evening, back at the installation, which had become something of a landmark in the disability community, a place where people came for retreats and conferences, Sarah and Daniel sat together, watching the sunset through the large windows she'd had installed years ago. "Do you ever regret it?" Daniel asked quietly. "Taking the money from the vault? Using it the way you did?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "The government left it there for 57 years. They wrote it off, forgot about it, would have destroyed it if I hadn't been here. That money was meant for an emergency, for a crisis. And we were the crisis. We were the emergency it was saved for. Maybe not the one they intended, but the one that mattered. Do you think you'll ever tell the whole story? Let people know where the money really came from?" "Someday," Sarah said, "when enough time has passed, when it can't hurt us anymore. It's a hell of a story. But for now, it's ours. Our secret, our miracle, our reminder of what's possible when you refuse to quit." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the colors bleed across the sky. The installation stood around them, solid and permanent, transformed from a ruin into a beacon. The vault in the basement was empty, but the legacy it had created filled every corner of the building and extended far beyond its walls. Sarah thought about the woman she'd been 15 years ago, desperate and homeless, carrying her disabled son through the dark corridors of this place, with nothing but a flashlight and hope. She'd been so afraid then, so uncertain, so convinced she was making a terrible mistake. And maybe she had been making a mistake by any reasonable assessment. But sometimes mistakes are just opportunities that haven't revealed themselves yet. Sometimes the crazy decision is the right one. Sometimes the worthless property contains priceless treasure. "I love you, Mom," Daniel said, breaking into her thoughts. "I love you too, baby," Sarah replied, the endearment still fitting, even though her baby was now a man. "Always." As darkness settled over the installation and stars began to appear in the clear sky above, Sarah felt something she'd never experienced in those desperate early days. Contentment. Not happiness exactly. Life was still complicated. Daniel still faced challenges. The world was still hard. But contentment. The deep satisfaction of knowing she'd done it. She'd saved her son. She'd built a life. She'd turned $1 and a dream into something real. The radar bunker had been designed to detect threats, to provide warning, to protect against destruction. In the end, it had protected something far more precious, a mother's love and a child's future. And the fortune that had waited in the darkness for over half a century had finally fulfilled its purpose. Not by funding the war it was meant for, but by giving two people who had lost everything a chance to find it again. Sarah Mitchell had walked into a condemned building with nothing but her son in her arms and a key in her pocket. She'd walked out 15 years later with a legacy that would help thousands. The world had called her crazy. Her family had called her irresponsible. The system had called her unfit. She had proven them all wrong. And in the quiet of the evening, in the warmth of the home she'd built from ruins, Sarah allowed herself a smile. She had won. They had won. And nothing, no judgment, no doubt, no fear, could take that away. The bunker's greatest treasure hadn't been the gold or the diamonds or the cash. It had been the opportunity it represented, the chance it provided, the hope it restored. And Sarah had taken that chance and turned it into everything. The winter Daniel turned 12 was when Sarah first allowed herself to cry in front of him about the early days. They were sitting in what had become her favorite room in the installation, the old control room she'd transformed into a library, lined with books about history, disability advocacy, and stories of resilience. Outside, snow blanketed the grounds in pristine white, making the bunker look less like a Cold War relic and more like something from a fairy tale. Daniel had been asking questions, the way he always did when his mind was working through something complex. "Mom, when we first got here, were you scared I would die?" The directness of it caught Sarah off guard. She'd spent years protecting him from the full truth of their desperation, softening the edges of their story. But he was older now, perceptive, and he deserved honesty. "Yes," she said quietly, setting down the book she'd been reading. "Every single day. I was terrified that the cold would be too much for your body, that I wouldn't be able to get you to a hospital if something went wrong, that I'd wake up one morning and you'd just be gone. I carried that fear like a stone in my chest." Daniel nodded slowly, processing this. "But you stayed anyway. You didn't take me back to the city, even though you were scared. Because going back meant surrendering to a system that had already failed us. It meant accepting that we would never have more than borrowed space and borrowed time. Here, even with all the danger, we had a chance at something permanent, something ours." "And then you found the vault," Daniel said. "And then I found the vault," Sarah agreed. "But Daniel, you need to understand something. The vault saved us, yes, but only because we'd already survived the worst of it. Only because we'd already proven we could endure. The money made things easier, but it didn't make us stronger. We were already strong." Daniel reached for her hand, his fingers no longer as twisted as they'd been in childhood, years of therapy having given him slightly more range of motion. "Tell me about the first time you saw the gold, what you felt." Sarah closed her eyes, remembering. "Terror," she said. "Not joy. I was so scared that I was hallucinating, that my mind had broken from the stress and was showing me things that weren't real. I left the vault and didn't go back for 2 days because I couldn't face the possibility that I'd imagined it all. But it was real. But it was real," Sarah confirmed. "And then the terror changed, because suddenly I had this incredible responsibility. I had the answer to every prayer sitting in a basement vault, but I had no idea how to access it without losing everything. It was like being handed a winning lottery ticket, written in a language you couldn't read." She told him about the sleepless nights spent calculating risks, about the paranoia that made her jump at every sound, convinced that government agents or thieves were coming to take it away. She told him about the first transaction with Marcus, how her hands had shaken so badly she could barely count the money he gave her. "I kept expecting someone to burst through the door and arrest me," she admitted. "Every single transaction for the first 2 years, I was certain it would be the one that got us caught. Even after the government sent the letter saying they had no interest in the property, I didn't fully believe it for another year." Daniel was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you think we deserved it? The money?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Sarah had wrestled with privately for years. "I think," she said carefully, "that deserve is a complicated word. Did we earn it through work? No. Were we owed it? Not really. But did we need it desperately? And did we use it to create something good? Yes, that has to count for something. She told him about the Foundation's latest project, a residential facility they were building for adults with severe disabilities, people who had aged out of family care but needed more support than institutional settings provided. That building will exist because of the vault, she said. 20 people will have dignity and comfort for the rest of their lives because of what we found. If that's not deserving, I don't know what is. 3 years later, when Daniel was 15, and Sarah received an unexpected visitor. A woman in her 70s, impeccably dressed, appeared at the installation's entrance and introduced herself as Margaret Hayes, daughter of Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hayes, the man whose journal Sarah had found. "I've been looking for this place for 40 years, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. My father commanded it, lived here for 6 years. After he retired, he talked about it sometimes, about the responsibility he'd carried, about the secrets he'd kept. He died when I was 30, and I've wanted to see it ever since." Sarah invited her in, giving her a tour of the restored spaces, while carefully avoiding any mention of the vault. Margaret moved through the corridors with a reverent touch, her fingers trailing along walls her father had once walked past daily. He was a good man, Margaret said as they sat in Sarah's office. Dedicated to his duty, but tortured by it too. He knew things that kept him awake at night. He once told me that every installation like this carried the weight of possible futures, preparations for horrors we prayed would never come. "Your father's journal helped me understand this place," Sarah said carefully. "I found it in one of the offices. It gave me insight into the installation's layout and purpose." Margaret smiled sadly. "He always was meticulous about records. It drove my mother crazy. He documented everything." She paused, her eyes searching Sarah's face. "Did you find the vault?" Sarah's heart stopped. "What?" "The vault," Margaret repeated calmly. "My father mentioned it once, near the end of his life. He said it haunted him, so knowing what was sealed down there, what might never be found, or might be found by the wrong people. He said he'd left clues, just in case someone worthy needed them someday. I'm guessing from your expression that you found them." For a long moment, Sarah considered lying, but something in Margaret's face, a knowing gentleness, made her choose truth. "I did," she said quietly. Margaret nodded. "Good. I'm glad it was someone who needed it, someone who would use it well. My father believed that resources existed to be used, especially for emergencies. Your situation, from what I've read about your foundation and your work, that was an emergency. You're not angry? You're not going to report it?" "Report what?" Margaret's smile widened. "Report that you're using a decommissioned property you legally own? That you found old military supplies that the government officially disclaimed?" "My dear, the only thing I'm upset about is that my father isn't here to see what you've built. He would have been proud." She reached into her purse and pulled out an old photograph, handing it to Sarah. It showed a younger Richard Hayes in uniform, standing in front of the installation, his expression serious but kind. "Keep this," Margaret said, "so you remember that this place had good people in it once, people who cared about protecting others. You're continuing that tradition, just in a different way." After Margaret left, Sarah sat for a long time with the photograph, feeling as though she'd received a blessing she hadn't known she needed. The weight of secrecy that had pressed on her for years lifted slightly, replaced by the understanding that what she'd done wasn't theft or luck, but a kind of inheritance that transcended legal paperwork. That evening, she showed Daniel the photograph and told him about Margaret's visit. "Her father left those clues for us," Sarah said. "Not specifically for us, but for whoever needed them. He wanted the vault to help someone. We just happened to be that someone." Daniel studied the photograph carefully. He looks like someone who understood sacrifice, he observed. Like someone who knew what it meant to carry responsibility. Like your mother, Sarah said, tapping his nose affectionately. Like both of us, Daniel corrected, and the simple acknowledgement of their shared burden, their partnership in survival and success, made Sarah's eyes well with tears she didn't try to hide. Years later, when reporters asked Sarah about the moment that changed everything, she never mentioned the vault directly. She spoke instead about the decision to take the bunker, about choosing to fight rather than surrender. But privately, in quiet moments with Daniel, she would return to that memory of standing in the vault for the first time, flashlight in hand, staring at a fortune that seemed both real and impossible. It wasn't the money that saved us, she would tell him. It was the hope. The money was just the tool. The hope was what kept us alive long enough to use it. And Daniel, wise beyond his years, would nod and add, "The money ran out eventually, but the hope never did." It was the truest thing either of them could say about the miracle they'd lived through together. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.